Welcome. I'm here today with Barry Fishman, who's a professor at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. Thank you for coming here, Barry.
Pleasure.
Barry is a friend and learned scholar, and will be talking to us today about a number of things. So can you define what design-based implementation research is?
Sure. So design-based implementation research, DBIR, to distinguish it from design-based research, which is something that people who study learning technologies or learning sciences are probably familiar with the idea of design-based research. But in design-based research, essentially, it's this notion of taking a theory about how people teach and learn, or a theory about the world in general. And colleagues like Paul Cobb refer to a small t theory. So we're not talking about like behaviorism or constructivism. We're talking about a theory like reflecting on what you say before you say it will help you formulate your thinking better, or reflecting on what someone else is. So for instance, the way Eric Mazur teaches physics, right? This notion of getting people to commit to an answer with a clicker system, and then you turn to your neighbor and you discuss your answer, and then you choose again, causes people to make the correct choice more often because they've had to articulate their thinking, and that reveals flaws in your thinking. That's sort of a small t theory of how to affect learning through design. And design-based research is built on that idea that you start with a theory, you create an intervention. It's very important that this kind of research is based not around just studying the way the world works, but intervening in the world. And you work iteratively, often really fundamentally in a real setting of some kind, a real classroom setting, a real workplace setting.
As opposed to a lab.
As opposed to a lab or an artificially created setting. But the real setting could be online, right? It could be an online community. And you iterate rapidly, looking for evidence that's directly tied to your theory of what should happen based on your intervention. And if you find that what you think should happen isn't happening, then you would either modify your theory a little bit based on what you observe, or modify the intervention. You know, if you believe in the theory, you would focus on the intervention and say, well, I haven't done this quite right yet. So that's DBR, design-based research.
Okay.
When we add the implementation to it, it's a recognition by those of us who are talking about DBIR. It's a recognition that very few, vanishingly few of the things that we develop and validate as successful or proposed successful interventions in education actually make it into real-world practice.
Right.
Mostly what happens is we learn a lot from the things that we do design-based research with. We learn a lot from intervention kind of research. And when the researcher's focus shifts, the intervention melts away. It just fades back to everyday practice. Even if the sort of residue of the intervention remains, so maybe you're talking about a clicker system, to go back to the Eric Mazur example. The clickers are what remains, but not the actual pedagogical practice that make it useful. Because school is very resistant to change, and when we do a lot of design-based work, often we create the conditions, I call it a greenhouse set of conditions, right, where everything's just right for that innovation to grow and to be fostered. And we have, a bunch of grad students in there sometimes making sure that the technology works, and that's not what gets in the way, because you don't want to study a thing and find out that, oh, it's because the kids forgot their passwords, that's why it didn't work. You don't learn anything from that kind of experience, or the network was down, or any number of things. So we tend to work hard to create ideal conditions. But the world doesn't contain ideal conditions. The world contains everyday conditions. And very few of the things we design are designed in a way that can live robustly outside of our careful tending. So design-based implementation research tries to take it starts with design-based research, and actually a number of other traditions of research like participatory design and community research and research practice partnerships, and tries to recast the enterprise to say, when you begin that design process, you need to cast the entire activity in a way that is building towards something that is inherently sustainable and scalable. And we have some principles that help make that possible. So the very first principle is the most important, which is that when you begin designing the intervention, it should exist because the developer, the researcher, the practitioner, the community have jointly negotiated the problem that the intervention is around. Because a lot of times we come in and say, we would love to work with you on an intervention, or we have an idea that would really increase kids' ability to do inquiry-based science. And so we create the conditions for inquiry-based science, and we build some great tools that really support inquiry, and our field has many examples of great inquiry-based science tools. But we don't really create the conditions under which the teacher would naturally be engaging in inquiry-based science, like the curriculum hasn't changed, or we leave in the test changes and it's not focused on inquiry or something like that. So we haven't, our notion of inquiry and the school's notion of inquiry weren't aligned to begin with. So by jointly negotiating the problem of practice, we try to make sure that we have a shared problem.
And that's part of the drawing from the participatory design aspects.
Yes, yes. And although even in participatory design, a lot of times it may be management, say, that comes in and says, well, we have this idea for how to redesign the plan on the floor, but we're going to involve the people who work on the line because they really know how the line works, which is even one step away from having someone on the line say, hey, I have an idea, this is a problem we actually have on the line, and we really want to fix this. There's an example from the Boston Public Schools and Harvard Graduate School of Education, actually, where an organization which is sort of a flagship organization in the DBIR world called the Strategic Education Research Partnership, they view their role as a mediating and coordinating center between practice and research, which is something that actually is very helpful in a DBIR world. And so they were working with Boston Public Schools, and Boston Public Schools had a problem with kids' performance on science exams. They came to talk to people at Harvard, and there were people at Harvard who study things like science literacy, well, really literacy. But they conceive of literacy in a particular researchy way that when they talk about the problem of literacy, science teachers say, yeah, but we're trying to teach science. But they found a way to negotiate a problem, which is that the real challenge the kids are having is they don't have science language, and so they can't do well on the science exams. And so they developed a science literacy intervention that didn't turn off the science teachers, who are very frequently reluctant to do something called literacy because they think they're doing science, and made sense and helped advance the research agenda of the researchers. And by combining those forces, they let the researcher work on a problem they thought was interesting, the schools were invested in a problem that they thought was critical, and when the two come together, you've got a jointly negotiated problem of practice.
Right.
The middle step, the second step in DBIR is just like design-based research. You iterate a lot. So you have to also make it clear to everyone that we don't have an answer. We have a path. And together we're going to figure out what works that, again, we think helps advance the state of knowledge and research and helps advance your practice. The third notion is that it is about contributing both to practice and theory, right? So you have to have this notion that we're not just trying to solve this problem, but we're trying to solve this problem in a way that we learn from, that other people with similar problems or analogous problems could also intervene in a similar way. Not the same way necessarily, because context is very important in this kind of work. And the final principle is to try to build system capacity from the beginning. So that loops around in some way back to this jointly negotiated problem of practice, but it says that when we do this, we're not just setting aside 5 classrooms that we're going to do this work in. We're actually working with the whole system to make sure that the superintendent is bought in, the community understands maybe what's going on here, that there's a pathway toward growth that isn't just saying, well, we'll just tinker here and see what happens, but that we're actually trying to build something that can grow and sort of fits into the overall agenda of the organization from the beginning too.
Okay.
So that's DBIR.
Okay. So thinking about DBIR, it's 2 questions I'll sort of wrap in one because there may be sort of overlap between them. But how does this methodology impact both practice and policy within the space of educational technology?
That's a great question. And in fact, one of the notions of DBIR is that it's a combination of learning sciences perspectives and policy research and implementation research perspectives, because those 2 fields have historically approached the world very differently. Learning scientists roll up their sleeves and get in there and create interventions that solve local problems. Policy folks tend to study implementation fidelity and look at the impact of programs that are already developed. But you need to combine the 2 perspectives to get something productive. Practice, it's a big shift because it's really trying to say to practitioners that, well, first it's expanding their collaborative role, right? Schools and classrooms and teachers have been partners and participants, but I think in a not very rich way in a lot of research. They give us permission to do work. And we're now saying, no, it's more than you giving me permission to do work in your classroom or to work with you as a partner. It's you being a full-on partner, a full instigator. You know, we're going to set direction together, and that means that whatever we're doing here is not a thing I own that you're helping with, but that we both own. So it's a shift in perspective, which is part of the struggle, by the way, is getting everyone to understand those role shifts, because there's unequal power relationships. A lot of this is also about sort of power relationships in research.
Right. So actually, oftentimes I'll hear someone say something like, well, I have an idea, I'm going to iterate on that idea, that must be design-based research or design-based implementation research. What do you think are the big missing pieces that people who come with that sort of more reduced vision of it are missing out on?
So we actually set out to try to find good examples of dissertations, say, that were design-based, and it's pretty hard, because usually what you see is one iteration. And people say, yes, but I know it won't be perfect, so we'll keep iterating in the future, and that's why it's design-based research. And maybe that's true, but hard to test as a claim. I think really it's, for us in DBIR, it's about this jointly negotiated problem. That's where it has to begin. And yes, somebody's dissertation should be on one iteration. Work happens in chunks. It's not, you can't say, well, check back in 5 years, right, and we'll see what happens. It's amazing how many times you see people claim something is design-based, and really it's an interesting start at something. It is a kind of experiment in the real world, but without the notion, I think the most important thing is to clarify what would the criteria be by which you would judge that your theory is working or not, or that your intervention is working or not. Are there clear evidence? Are there clear moments in the design cycle when you stop and assess what's going on? Do you have a clear agenda for how you will make decisions based on the evidence you're gathering for revision? Those are all sort of the hallmarks of real design-based research and real design-based implementation research. Good. I think it's not a huge leap from where a lot of people claim to be, but it's a little bit of a leap.
But there's important differences. I mean, I think you mentioned the idea that first of all, I'm going to have a theory, which is a little bit different than an idea.
Right.
Yes. I'm going to have ways of revising that, and I have specific things I might learn about that. I think the idea of the sort of equal partnerships and where the ideas originate from is really important in that as well. Thanks, Barry. Thanks for talking to us about all these things. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. And look forward to hearing more of your work as it moves forward.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm glad you're doing this series, and I wish you great success.
Thanks.